Okay, welcome everyone to our group presentation. We are excited to share with you all of the data analysis we found during our research on the topic of climate conflict migration through the case studies of Bangladesh and South Sudan. So imagine that by 2050, we will have 143 million climate migrants. This is a number estimated by the Asian Development Bank in 2018. And if we look back in 2017, we have already seen 68.5 million people who are forcibly displaced, a number far beyond than at any point in human history. Out of this number, around 24 million people were forced to move by the sudden onsets of weather events such as flooding, droughts, and intensified storms. Climate change is also contributing to the slow onsets of desertification, sea level rising, ocean acidification, air pollution, rain pattern shifts, and loss of biodiversity. These events too could lead to further environmental migration. So obviously this climate-induced migration is currently one of the most pressing problems. So our group thought that this is a great opportunity to explore the correlations of this phenomenon. First, next slide, please. First, let me walk you through the contradicting views on the climate migration conflict nexus. There are not enough studies on climate and conflict that point into the direction that climate change has a direct influence on violence. However, most studies agree that climate change influences other factors that in turn lead to conflict. So how do we understand this correlation between climate and conflict? The suggestion is that we have to explicitly examine the two-stage process, from climate change to risk factors and from the risk factors to conflict. Unfortunately, there are not many studies that closely observe climate and conflict in this aspect. Another challenge is that since climate change is by definition a long-term process, and it also relies on uncertain attribution of extreme weather events, in this case, we lack data and tools to document climate change-induced impacts on migration. In my opinion, even though we cannot systematically collect quantifiable data, it is right in front of our face that people are forced to move because of climate-related costs. But I do agree that climate change is not only the only reason. Finally, how do we accurately detect and assess the impacts of climate change on natural and human systems? As there are several factors other than climate change that come into play and influence human actions and decisions. Next, please. When it comes to the types of migration, most studies only focus on international migration. However, environmental migrants can be internal or international. Mostly this type of migrants usually move within their national borders rather than migrating outside of their countries. This environmental displacement can be temporary or permanent, but most migration after extreme weather events is usually temporary, or even if it's permanent, these migrants will only settle nearby and within the national border, as we can see later on in the Bangladesh case study. However, what causes international migration, as we will see in the case of South Sudan, is not merely from environmental drivers, but from a much rather complex combination of political, socio-economic issues, including environmental issues. In terms of conflict, there is less potential for conflict in communities that receive internal migration flows due to disaster, because these migrants are likely to move to areas with a similar ethnic origin, language, and culture. So compared to international migrants who are forced to accept a refugee status in another country, we're more likely to trigger conflicts as they can be perceived as a threat to local communities. And that is all for the general overview of these climate migration conflict issues. Now let's move on to our two case studies. First, let's start with Bangladesh.
Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries on earth. It is set to become even more climate vulnerable as a result of the effects of climate change. It is expected that the climate change will exacerbate many of the natural hazards faced by Bangladesh. Let me introduce some general information of the Bangladesh. Dhaka is the capital city of Bangladesh, and the population is around 161 million people. It received the independence from Pakistan in 1971, and the country relies heavily on the textile industry. Next slide. Bangladesh vulnerability to natural hazards also leads to climate displacement, which is the forced displacement of individuals and communities from their homes and lands. This is as a result of both, as Linda has mentioned, sudden onset events such as floods, cyclone, riverbank erosion, as well as the slow onset processes such as coastal erosion, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, and change in rainfall pattern and drought. Next slide. The Association for Climate Refugees reported that 6 million individuals have already been displaced by the effect of the climate hazards in Bangladesh, and roughly half of those have been displaced because of the tidal floods and riverbank erosion. As you can see on the slide, that in the mainland, riverbank erosion is the main problem causing the displacement, whereas the tidal floods, as a result of sea level rise, affecting the coastal area. And it is significant because more than 28% of the population of Bangladesh live in the coastal region of the country. Next slide, please. Let me guide you to the statistic of the two causes. The first one is the tidal of flood that have affected 236 sub-districts in the coastal area. It is traumatizing since most of the villages have been flooded by the tidal saline water twice a day for the last 3 years. On the right-hand side of the slide, the graph showed that the 32% of the inhabitants, which is 2.4 million, have had their homes and land destroyed by repeated cyclone and king tides. Of that number, 64% have been displaced locally, 27% have been displaced to other locations within Bangladesh, and 9% have been displaced across international borders. And for the mainland displacement, next slide. River bank erosion has affected 179 sub-districts in the mainland areas of Bangladesh. Most of the villages in the affected sub-district have been eroded by flash flood water every year for the past 3 decades. However, 42% of the inhabitants, which is 1.4 million, have had their houses and land destroyed by annual river erosion, often coupled with floods. Of that number, again, 66% have been displaced locally, 26% have been displaced to other locations in the countries, and 8% have been displaced across international borders. As you can see from my presentation, the climate displacement in Bangladesh is very severe, and next Johnny will propose and discuss about how the government and international agencies have assisted the country.
The Bangladesh government put out a statement saying that it is essential that Bangladesh prepares now to adapt to climate change and safeguard the future well-being of its citizens. The government is unequivocal in its commitment to protect the people from the ravages of climate change. The government has produced 2 key documents that outline its policy and strategy in the area of climate change adaptation. The first being the Bangladesh National Adaptation Program of Action, or NAPA, in 2005, and the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan in 2009. And the 2005 action plan identified many adverse climatic impacts of climate change, many of which have clear links with climate displacement. Those listed are scarcity of fresh water due to less rain and higher evapotranspiration in the dry season, drainage congestion due to higher water levels in a confluence with the rise of sea level, riverbank erosion, frequent floods and prolonged and widespread drought, and water salinity in the surface, ground, and soil in the coastal zone. It was found that the population living in the coastal area are more vulnerable than the population in other areas. But this action plan does not articulate any concrete links between climate change and displacement. However, in 2009, the action plan draws direct links between climate change and displacement in Bangladesh. They outline that increased riverbank erosion and saline water intrusion in coastal areas are likely to displace hundreds of thousands of people, However, surveys undertaken by the Association of Climate Refugees suggest that this number is likely to be more accurately in the millions of people displaced. The action plan also states that if sea level rise is higher than currently expected and coastal polders are not strengthened and or new ones built, then 6 to 8 million people could be displaced by 2050 and would have to be resettled. They highlight that the role of monitoring this displacement and ensuring institutional support for proper resettlement lies with the Ministry of Environment and Forestries, the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the Ministry of Local Government, Rural Development, and Cooperative. Next, we'll be talking about international intervention. Under the 1951 Refugee Convention, a refugee is a person owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Thus, at a minimum, a climate-displaced person from Bangladesh must be outside of Bangladesh before that they can claim the protection of the Refugee Convention. They would then need to demonstrate that if they were to return to Bangladesh, that they would face a well-founded risk of being persecuted, and that the persecution would be for one of the enumerated reasons listed above. Because of this gap in international protection, there is considerable discussion about whether and how to reform international refugee law. The protection of internally displaced people states that persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. But although the guiding principles provided above are relevant standards for the protection of climate displaced people, a key issue is that they are not legally binding to the government of Bangladesh.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about South Sudan. South Sudan is the world's newest country and has faced lots of hardships since its creation. The capital of South Sudan is Juba. The population is around 11 million people, but the population growth rate has been on the decline since 2010. The current population growth rate is only 1.19%. Not only is it a young country, it also has a young population. The average age of their citizenship is only 19 years. South Sudan is also really reliant on oil, with 90% of the revenue coming from oil. As you can see, it is completely landlocked. And all of these factors create more challenges for the people of South Sudan.
Now we take a look at the genesis of the North-South divide of Sudan. Sudan was under British Egyptian rule at the end of the 19th century, where the North and South had different reactions to the British colonization. The North accepted it and allowed the British to import its culture and modernize the country, whereas the South rejected it, leading to a contrast in development between the North and South. After independence in 1956, both the North and South struggled to integrate with one another, since the North was mainly white Muslims and the South Black Christians. The racial composition, religious beliefs, and an attempt to impose Sharia law by the North gradually through the country, which led to a civil war spanning 16 years. The war eventually ended with the signing of the Addis Ababa Agreement, which included the establishment of an autonomous South Sudan. 10 years later, the Sudanese government canceled the autonomy arrangements and retried to impose Sharia law, again leading to a 22-year-long war, killing millions and leaving millions more displaced. In 2005, another peace agreement gave semi-autonomous status, freedom from Islamic law, and the ability to vote for independence in 6 years later in 2011. In 2011, 98.8% of the population voted for South Sudan's secession and independence, but peace did not last long. 1 year later, the president accused the vice president of planning a coup and dissolved the cabinet. The two leaders were from two different ethnic groups, which sparked fighting and led to one of the biggest humanitarian crises in modern history. In 2018, a peace deal was signed between president and vice president, formally ending a 5-year war that had killed tens of thousands. And in 2020, the president announced a full cabinet, ending an anxious wait for the formation of a government crafted from a 2018 peace deal. To date, the country remains underdeveloped with poor sanitation, a disconnected transport system, a non-existent health sector, and little to no access to drinking water and food, with a population living mostly in abject poverty. The country has had several bouts of famines, mass flooding, droughts, locust swarms, which have disturbed their food supply and diseases, to name a few, forcing people to migrate both internally and internationally.
And now to look a little bit at the environmental situation in South Sudan. The environmental situation in South Sudan has been devastated by soil degradation due to erosion from water and wind, as well as fire, loss of biodiversity from poaching and degrading the wildlife from practices such as farming and extraction of oil. There's been a lot of water pollution caused by rising populations in urban areas and dumping chemicals into their waterways. There's also a large amount of fishery exploitation, and due to climate change, there has been delayed or short rains and dried up rivers, which both impact the peoples as well as the environment. Oil and poor farming practices are at the heart of South Sudan, which also worsens all of these problems. Oil exploration has been in place is that should have also been protected like wetlands.
According to the 2018 statistics, most South Sudanese people fled to Uganda and other to nearby countries, with some even to European countries such as the United Kingdom, Italy, and France to seek asylum. The United Kingdom is their first preference since it is deemed as the easiest to integrate given there is no language barrier. But since that they have tightened their borders, refugees have encountered difficulty to enter. To get to these countries, people must trek through Libya onto Italy and then travel through the Mediterranean Sea on wooden boats or dinghies. This journey is considered extremely risky, and even though hundreds have drowned, migrants still see this as a last resort to them having a better life. Those who remain, however, migrate closer to the Nile system, which is made up of swamps, marshland, and rivers, using it as a source of food and water, or in overcrowded camps with poor sanitation, but almost all rely on food, water, aid, and protection from the UN and other NGOs since they are constantly under attack. Unfortunately, these areas are prone to floods that usually cause the river to burst its banks, leaving most makeshift homes battered and the people in need of shelter, loss of crops, and livestock, creating other crises. This picture is just one of the thousands of dinghies overturning filled with migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. This breakdown of South Sudan's situation in 2020 shows that 7.5 million of the estimated population in South Sudan required humanitarian assistance, with another 6.5 million acutely food insecure. 181,231 individuals seeking refuge at UN mission, and 1.6 million estimated number of internally displaced persons, with finally 2.2 refugees in neighboring countries.
Okay, to analyze the international support, the United States has organized the largest international aid donors to give $108 million to South Sudan. However, they never said where this money was going to go. And in the large scheme of things, will it be enough money? I don't know. The World Food Program has been giving food and is still fundraising to help end hunger in South Sudan. However, they don't discuss systemic issues or how to solve them. Also, the UN has stated that based on their needs, as well as UN funding, they will create a portfolio of projects to help the situation. And most of that funding comes from the Norwegian Agency for Development and Cooperation.
As you can see from these two case studies in South Sudan and Bangladesh, climate change is definitely one of the main drivers for migration and conflict. However, from the available literature at the moment, there is no clear consensus as to how substantial is the direct impact of climate change on worldwide conflict, or if the role of climate migration will induce this so-called climate war. The challenge is that comprehensive data sets on environmental migration or planned relocation do not yet exist at the global level. But it doesn't mean that we cannot view climate change as a threat to human security that undermines millions of people's livelihoods. In the process, it also disrupts the culture and identity of both migrants and the host community as it widens the gap of otherness and inequalities. Some countries are better than others at finding mitigation plans as they have a stronger government and economy. But for other poorer countries, this climate change issue can challenge their ability to preserve human security. And because our human security is at risk, it is important to understand and be able to explain the implications of environmental or climatic changes in relation to conflict, so we can further drive policies and well-informed decisions that will mitigate future conflict as well as climate change. Let us conclude the presentation by reinstating that environment and climate change is important, but we need to make sure we do not depoliticize the issues people face by blaming climate change for the problems people are facing. And South Sudan is a perfect example to showcase this importance. Thank you.